In 1998, deep inside the Vatican secret archives, a team of restorers made a discovery that would shake the foundations of Catholic history. While repairing a crumbling section of the 14th century records wing, they found something that had been deliberately hidden behind a false wall, sealed away from the world for over 600 years. What they uncovered was a lead chest, heavy and ancient, locked with 6 padlocks and covered entirely in Latin inscriptions. The words were not blessings, they were warnings. Whoever opens this will suffer eternal excommunication. One line read. Another stated simply, "What rests here must remain forgotten. God have mercy on the one who dares to read these words." After weeks of heated debate among senior cardinals, men who understood the weight of what they might be unleashing, the chest was finally opened. Inside lay a single manuscript, its pages bound in what forensic analysis would later confirm was human skin. Carbon-14 testing dated it precisely to the year 1334. What those pages contained was so profoundly disturbing that 2 curators resigned immediately, unable to reconcile what they had read with their faith. A third requested an immediate transfer to another continent, refusing to ever speak of what he had seen. The manuscript was the personal diary of Pope John XXII, written in his own hand during the final years of his reign. Not the official journal filled with papal decrees and diplomatic correspondence, but his secret writings, penned alone in the darkness after midnight. And the ink used to write those confessions had been mixed with his own blood. The entries revealed something that should have been impossible. The Supreme Pontiff, the Vicar of Christ on earth, the man who stood as God's chosen representative to over 60 million Catholics across Europe, had spent nearly 2 decades descending into a hidden chamber beneath his private chapel every single night at midnight. And there, in that sealed room where no witness could hear, he cursed God. Not once, not in a moment of weakness, but systematically, ritually, with the fury of a man who had been abandoned. "I curse God for placing this crown upon me," one entry from March 1334 began. "I curse Christ for his silence. I curse the Holy Spirit for abandoning me in this golden cage. If hell exists, I am already inside it, and if the devil lives, he wears my crown." These were not the words of a madman scribbling in the margins of sanity. They were the careful, deliberate confessions of one of the most powerful men in medieval Europe, a man who had shaped Catholic doctrine that remains in effect to this very day. Pope John XXII had ruled from 1316 to 1334. Presiding over the church during one of its most influential periods, building the magnificent papal palace in Avignon, controlling the fates of kings and emperors, yet every midnight for 18 years, he descended into darkness to wage a private war against the very God he claimed to serve. Jacques Douze was born in 1244 in Kehtay, France, the son of a modest shoemaker. He was not born into nobility or wealth. What he possessed was a brilliant mind and an unshakable work ethic. He studied medicine and canon law in Paris and Montpellier, eventually becoming one of the most respected theologians of his age. By 40 he was a bishop, by 60 a cardinal, and at 72 years old, in August of 1316, he was elected pope, taking the name John XXII. But here is what the history books rarely mention. Jacques never wanted the position. In letters to his younger brother written before the conclave, he expressed not ambition but dread. He had watched what the papacy did to men, how it twisted their faith and turned them into tyrants who ruled in God's name while losing God entirely in the process. "The papacy is not an honor," he wrote. "It is a punishment, and I do not wish to be condemned." The cardinals chose him for precisely that reason. They wanted someone old, compliant, and unlikely to live long. A placeholder who would not interfere with their own political maneuvering. They expected him to die within a year or 2. Instead, Jacques Douze would live to 90 years old and rule the Catholic Church with iron discipline for nearly 2 decades, becoming one of the most powerful popes in history. But in his private writings, a very different story began to emerge, one of a man being slowly crushed beneath the weight of an impossible burden. The first few years seemed outwardly normal. John established his court in Avignon, far from the political chaos of Rome, and began constructing the grandest palace in Europe. He amassed treasures that rivaled any king, issued decrees that expanded church authority beyond anything seen before, and presided over a period of unprecedented papal influence. But in a diary entry from 1320, just 4 years into his reign, the cracks began to show. "I have prayed endlessly, yet God stays silent," he wrote. "I have fasted nearly to death, and Christ does not answer. I am starting to believe this throne is cursed, that whoever sits upon it can no longer hear God because God has stopped speaking." That was the beginning of his descent. The moment when faith turned to doubt, and doubt began to rot into something far darker. The breaking point came in 1323, 7 years into his papacy. The Franciscan order, followers of Saint Francis who had taken vows of absolute poverty, declared that Jesus and the apostles had owned no possessions, that the church should live in the same radical poverty Christ had preached. But John, ruling from a palace more opulent than any monarch's, could not allow that belief to stand. To defend the church's immense wealth, he declared the Franciscan position heretical and began persecuting those who refused to recant. That night, alone in his chambers, he opened his secret diary and wrote words that would doom him if anyone had discovered them. I studied the Gospels and realized something terrible. Christ told us to give all to the poor, to store no treasure on earth, to live as beggars, yet I live as an emperor. If Christ was right, I am the Antichrist, and if I am right, then Christ was wrong. Either way, I am damned. If this story has gripped you, if you want to uncover more secrets that powerful institutions have buried for centuries, subscribe now, because the truth hidden in the shadows is always more terrifying than the lies told in the light. And what happens next in Pope John's story will make you question everything you thought you knew about faith and power. It was after that realization in 1323 that the midnight rituals began. According to fragmentary letters from Cardinal Francesco Orsini, one of the few men who remained close to the Pope during his final years, John ordered a secret chamber constructed beneath his private chapel. Only he held the key. No one, not even his most trusted advisors, was permitted inside, and every night, precisely at midnight, he would descend the narrow stone staircase into that sealed room. The guards stationed at the entrance reported hearing things that filled them with terror, shouting in Latin, words hurled not in prayer but in fury, the sound of objects being smashed against stone walls, and sometimes, in the silence between the outbursts, weeping, deep, anguished sobs from a man who had no one left to confess to. But none dared interrupt because he was the Pope, and popes, by definition, could not be questioned. What John performed in that hidden chamber was a ritual of reversal, a deliberate and systematic desecration of everything he represented. He would take the sacred elements of the Eucharist, consecrate the bread and wine according to church tradition, transforming them by his own authority into the body and blood of Christ, and then he would crush them beneath his feet. He recited the holy prayers backward, twisting them into curses directed not at demons but at God himself. One diary entry from 1325 reveals the depth of his torment. Tonight I begged God to appear, to give me a sign that he is real, that suffering has meaning. Nothing, only silence. So I stopped praying. I began cursing. And in cursing I found more comfort than in 1,000 unanswered prayers. Things took an even more catastrophic turn in 1331, when John delivered a sermon that nearly tore the Catholic Church apart. He declared publicly that the souls of the righteous, even the saints, do not enter heaven immediately upon death. Instead, they must wait in a state of unknowing until the final judgment at the end of time. This directly contradicted centuries of established Catholic doctrine. Cardinals were horrified. Kings across Europe threatened to sever ties with Rome. The University of Paris formally accused the Pope of teaching heresy. But what no one understood was that this was not theology. It was despair speaking through the mouth of the Church's highest authority. In his private writings, John confessed the truth. I have proclaimed that heaven does not yet exist because I fear it never has. I have spent my entire life promising the faithful a paradise I have never seen, never felt, never proven. And if it is all a lie, then perhaps we have built our faith upon a mirage. What if God is not love but silence? What if Christ never rose, and we are worshipping the echo of our own desperation? Had anyone read those words while John still lived, he would have been deposed, excommunicated, possibly executed. But each night after writing, he hid his diary in a secret compartment carved behind a crucifix in his private quarters, the same crucifix which, according to terrified servants, he always kept turned to face the wall. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He grew paranoid, accusing loyal advisors of plotting against him. He dismissed servants without explanation and avoided celebrating public mass, delegating the duty to lesser bishops. But what disturbed the cardinals most was his physical appearance. Portraits from his final years depict a gaunt, hollow-faced old man with dark rings beneath his eyes and an expression of perpetual terror. An anonymous court painter noted in his personal journal in 1333, "His Holiness no longer resembles a living man. His eyes do not catch the light. They stare into something no other soul can see." And then came the night in August of 1333 that almost exposed everything. It was the Feast of the Assumption, one of the holiest nights in the Catholic calendar. John descended as usual into his hidden chamber, but this time something went catastrophically wrong. Hours passed. When he did not emerge by dawn, his personal secretary, defying strict orders, unlocked the chamber and descended into the darkness. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Pope John XXII lay collapsed on the cold stone floor, surrounded by dozens of extinguished black candles. The walls were covered in strange symbols, possibly drawn in blood. Shattered fragments of a crucifix lay scattered around him, and in his trembling hand, he clutched a piece of parchment on which he had scrawled a single sentence. The secretary later swore, though he was never allowed to repeat it publicly, that he heard the Pope whisper, "Forgive me, Satan, I have served the wrong master." The man was paid an enormous sum in gold, threatened with excommunication if he ever spoke of what he had seen, and sent to a monastery in the farthest reaches of Ireland where he lived in silence until his death. The chamber was cleansed, sealed with concrete, and never spoken of again. But John's diary reveals what truly happened that night, and modern psychiatrists who have studied his writings in recent years have identified clear signs of severe psychological collapse. Some suggest bipolar disorder, others the onset of dementia, At nearly 80 years old, his mind may have been fragmenting under the unbearable weight of his contradictions. But other scholars propose something far more unsettling, that he was not mad at all, that his blasphemies were not the product of insanity, but of terrible clarity about the role he played and the suffocating silence of the divine. Religious historians note that the 14th century was an age of profound spiritual crisis across Europe. The Black Death would arrive just 14 years after John's death, killing a third of the continent's population. The papal schism would soon split the church in two, with rival popes excommunicating each other, and men like John XXII, who held absolute authority at the height of church power, were witnesses to its deep, systemic hypocrisy. The pope lived in unimaginable luxury while preaching humility. He blessed wars of conquest while proclaiming peace. He sold salvation to the wealthy while condemning the starving poor for stealing bread to survive. All of this in the name of a God who was supposed to embody love and justice. Was it madness to recognize that contradiction, or madness to ignore it? Pope John XXII died on December 4, 1334, at 90 years old, officially from natural causes. Unofficial accounts, whispered in the corridors of Avignon, suggested he may have been quietly poisoned by cardinals who could no longer tolerate his unpredictable behavior. What happened immediately after his death is where the true conspiracy begins. According to documents uncovered in 2003 by Italian historian Francesca Lombardi, Cardinal Bertrand Digot, the first to enter the Pope's private chambers after his death, discovered the secret diary hidden behind the crucifix. He read it through the night, and at dawn summoned an emergency meeting with the 6 most powerful cardinals in the church. Their first instinct was to burn it, to erase every trace. But Bertrand argued for a different approach. If we destroy it and someone else knows of its existence, we will be accused of a cover-up. If we hide it and seal it, we control the narrative. What cannot be seen cannot be questioned. And so they placed the diary in a lead casket, inscribed it with warnings of damnation, and buried it in the deepest vaults of the Vatican archives. Then they initiated a systematic campaign to erase John's darkest years from history. Letters were burned, chronicles were rewritten, servants who had heard the midnight screams were exiled to distant monasteries under vows of eternal silence. The secret chamber was filled with concrete and forgotten. For over 6 centuries, the strategy worked perfectly. Until 1998, when restoration workers broke through a false wall and found what was never supposed to be found. The question that haunts us now is not whether Pope John XXII was a heretic. The question is why the Vatican was so terrified of the truth being known. Because if the world discovered that even popes, the supposed earthly representatives of God, could doubt, could blaspheme, could buckle and break under the crushing weight of impossible responsibility, what would remain of the Church's authority? The power of the papacy has never rested on the truth of its claims. It rests on the illusion of absolute certainty, and that illusion cannot survive human honesty. That is why John was erased, not for evil, but for being honest. And honesty, at the highest levels of religious power, remains the most unforgivable sin. His final diary entry, written the night before his death, read simply, "I have sought God all my life and found only silence. I have cursed him through the night and found only echo. Now at the end, I wonder if God and silence are the same. If so, then all prayers were addressed to nothing, and at least nothing never deceives." So here's the question I leave with you. Was Pope John XXII a heretic who deserved to be erased from history, or was he the most honest man ever to sit on the throne of St. Peter? Your answer may reveal more about your own relationship with faith, doubt, and power than you realize. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this is a conversation that has been silenced for far too long.